welcome, and as always, questions are good.
Chris, start without a question. I just want to thank the two of you for the 5 years I've been coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You made me a better person in the garden.
Well, I've always enjoyed having you in the audience because you always have the most wonderful smile on your face.
No, thank you.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate everybody who comes out for these tours. The topic today is, sort of the general topic is Xeric plants, Xeric, not a term that's commonly used in English language, I guess unless you live in California or the southwest of this country. But, ecologists describe areas as either hydric, mesic, or xeric. And so hydric obviously is referring to water, they're wet sites. Xeric referring to dry sites. And mesic, sort of in between. And somebody's going to ask me how many inches of rain does that come out to. I do not know. I don't feel like I really need to know. We are in the humid east. We live in a largely mesic environment with periods of flooding and periods of drought. So we will see a lot of plants that are very drought tolerant today, and we'll talk about a lot of strategies that plants have for dealing with drought, periodic drought, but the focus will be primarily on the plants. And thank you, interns, for showing up. I was starting to think you weren't going to. We have 5 interns today, and remember, next month they will be leading the tour, talking about roughly about 3 of their plants I think are of note in the Arboretum. It's always a really fun time. So I hope you and others will come out for that tour. We are going to head this way, go up to the roof. When we go to the Xeric garden, we're going down a long flight of steps. If anybody has a problem with that, we could take a different route back down. We'll get started. We haven't yet quite gotten to the roof, as yes, you very well know. Look at that lovely live oak seedling that come up everywhere. And they're a nuisance to dig out. They have such a taproot. But I do want to start at this very notable Xeric plant. This is one of the Hesper Aloes. Hesper referring to the evening. I guess maybe the flowers sort of open up more in the evening than they are right now. Well, I don't know if that's the case because the hummingbirds will visit these all day longs. But I think it's next week. The talk is on the Asparagaceae, which is related to this, in that decades ago, the lily family encompassed a huge number of plants. And there were, including yuccas, agaves, Hesperallos, Desolariums, and other similar plants. And they are commonly referred to as woody lilies because they were in the lily family back then. And many of them have woody stems, but Hesperallo is one of them. This is not the common Hesperalo Parvaflora. This is Hesperella Companioleda. Campanelle referring to a bell, a little bell. The flowers are sort of bell-shaped, and they bloom for months and months and months in the summer, regardless how dry it gets. And as I mentioned, the hummingbirds do like them. They're very small-scale plants, relatively speaking, compared to other woody lilies, and permanent in the garden. We'll see plants of Hesperalo Parvaflora elsewhere today. Any questions on that? I think anybody who wants to support hummingbirds should have a Hesperalo in their garden if they have enough sun. We're going to stop at a completely unrelated plant, and when Chris edits this, he can cut out this whole section. Where did Chris go? There's Chris. Yeah. This isn't quite yet in bloom, but when this is bloom, lots of visitors will be asking, what is that fragrance? It fills this whole part of the Arboretum with a fragrance. It's a linden, a Tilia Julianae, I think? No. It's named for one of the English plant collectors. Oh, where are you? Where's your label? Well, I think it's Tilia Julianae. It has this marvelous toothed edge to Henryi has this wonderful tooth. Here, you can pass it around, toothed edge to the leaf. And like, I think all lindens do this. Let me set that down. Has this interesting bract above the inflorescence, and the flowers are small. But this one is very fragrant, and the Arboretum has quite a few species of linden, and quite a few of them are wonderful fragrant. They're also notable for being a good plant for pollinators. And I don't know if anybody's ever had linden tea. It's made from the flowers. But if you're here, probably later on this week or the next couple of weeks, that'll perfume a good part of the Arboretum. We won't linger over the geophyte border, the bulb border, but of course, one strategy with dealing with dry weather is going dormant during the dry time of the year. So that's a strategy that many bulbs have. That's why many plants are bulbous, because they go dormant during the dry part of the year and then return when the rains return. Surviving the dry spell in the bulb underground. And I use bulb in a broad sense because the Syninges, this is Syninges Soloviana, one of the wild parents of the hybrids we'll see today, makes a big tuber underground, really quite large. I've never dug up a long established plant, but just in a pot it'll make a good sized tuber underground. And they're very drought tolerant, but the Syninge is not an example of a bulbous plant that goes dormant, but a lot of bulbs are native to the Mediterranean climates where there's a dry season and a wet season. So plants native around the Mediterranean Ocean or South Africa or other areas of the world characterized by a Mediterranean climate. And the Mediterranean climate is characterized by a wet season and a dry season. And in many of those areas, it's the winter growing, winter time when plants grow, because then there's moisture available and the weather's a little bit milder. I'm hoping that at the end of the bulb border, the other wild parent of the hybrid Syninge is in bloom. This is a hybrid with the cultivar name of Lovely. Its growth habit is more typical of the other wild parent, Syningia tubiflora, where it has basal foliage and then scapes arising from the ground rather than, the tall upright stem like Soloviana. But a similar Syningia, who is this? I think this is Arkansas Bells. You see the growth habit is much more like the Soloviana hybrid at the end of the border. And there's a red one back there. Scarlet Bells, I think. But nice yellow one here. Bananas Foster. And these Syningias will bloom all summer long and into the fall up until cold weather. So they really, really earn their keep. This is full sun all day. And, like most of the Arboretum, we don't irrigate except in, extremely dry spells. Like we're starting to do some watering in the garden so we don't lose quality. But, except for the lath house, there's no part of the Arboretum that's watered on a regular basis. Dahlias are the wild parents of dahlias are native to Mexico, and they're fairly drought tolerant, but they perform better if they're not drought stressed. They will survive drought, but if you want them to do well, I wouldn't recommend them for a Xeric garden. And the bulb border is not really a Xeric planting from the standpoint that we try to keep stuff, blooming all year round in the bulb border. Okay. Now, as we come, we consider this the roof garden, even though we're not, we have another 50 feet before we actually get up on the roof. And this little rock garden is not really a xeric planting, but there are some xeric plants of note in it. And it's a little bit shabby now because some of the things that were so pretty earlier are going to seed. The little Iberis simplex is a little annual, maybe you could consider it a biennial. The plants that have blooms for months are now setting seed. You know, these will turn brown and be shed, and then there'll be a carpet of seedlings, which we always have to thin out, but we always leave some because they earn their keep in the spring when they carpet themselves with these flowers that I guess open white and then turn sort of lavender. But this is its foliage. It's a tiny little thing, but really earns its keep. And another annual that reseeds every year is this Jazzione, which is just starting to bloom. Will bloom also, a good part of the summer. I'm worried about that Campanula because I think that might be actually that real aggressive spreading adenophyre. We raised it as something else, but sometimes when you get seeds from other organizations, they're not always what they're supposed to be. The umbel family, the family that, common members of the umbel family, the Umbelliferae, well, actually, it's now the Apiaceae, are parsley and dill and fennel and parsnips and celery. But this is one that's grown as an ornamental. It's the moon carrot, Cecily Gamifera. I can pull the label out if you want to see it. Did you see that all right? Cecily Gamiferum. It's a biennial, or monocarpic at least. First year or so, it makes this basal rosette of really pretty, finely dissected blue foliage. And then the year it decides to bloom, this is what it does. And being an umbel, a member of that family, I suspect later on when this is in sun, there'll be lots of pollinators visiting the flowers. Now the specific epithet, the second part of a species name, Gamiferum, means bearing gum. FER always refers to bearing, like bearing gifts. And I wasn't able to find any information on the culinary or medicinal use of this plant. And I do have to say, even though there are a lot of edible members of this family, there's also some deadly poisonous members of this family, such as deadly poison hemlock and water hemlock. Despite the hemlock name, they are not at all related to our conifers hemlocks. So I'm not going to taste this without knowing whether or not it's edible, because I consider all members of this family poisonous until I know better. But if you do any Indian cooking, you might know a spice, or I guess it would be considered a spice, Asafetida. It's from another member of this family, and it's collected as a gum. And the way it's collected is the big what is I'm forgetting the genus of Asafetida, but when it starts to put up the inflorescence and the Asafetida plants get really big, Ferula is the genus, Ferula, they cut it to the ground, and then the stump of the flower stalk starts to ooze the sap, which solidifies into a gum, and that's what is collected and used in cooking. It has this really funky taste. And my impression is that, Asafetida, I don't know what the asa part is referring to, but fetida means smelling bad, or, fetid, the English word fetid. And I think in Indian cooking, Asafetida is largely used by the Jains, who are vegetarians, but sort of many steps beyond your typical vegetarian, because they don't even eat certain plants. Like they won't eat bulbs like onions and garlic, and I think they don't eat fruit until it falls from the tree. They won't pick a fruit from a tree. And Asafetida, not so much when you taste it by itself, but when it's added to a dish, sort of imparts that oniony garlic flavor. I use it. I do a lot of Indian cooking. I want to point out one little plant that, I suspect when lots of people see a fern growing in this very sunny, dry spot, they think, well, we're a bunch of idiots around here and don't know any better. Why did we plant a fern in the sun? And we do associate ferns with shade, but there are ferns that definitely grow in sun. And this is one of the little rock ferns. It used to be in the genus Chilanthes, but they now have put it in a new genus, Myriopterus, which I guess means many wings or many fronds. And it's a Mexican species, Java pensis, from the ensis ending always indicating that it's from somewhere. So it's from Yavapen. I don't know anything more about that geographic location than that. But we have native hairy lip ferns that occur in this area. If you're out in the woods, certainly like on boulders along a stream where it's sunny and there's not too much overhead shade, they'll grow on the leaf litter on a boulder. Chilanthes, or probably now Myriopterus lanosa, is a local little fern that is a rock fern or growing in sun. They seed about, and they'll come up in slightly shadier spots than this, but they certainly tolerate this. But it's not the only genus of sun ferns. There was another one in this bed, but I think it has died out, different genus. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Behind Chris is a salvia. The genus Salvia is in the mint family, the Lamiaceae. And the mint family is huge. It includes not just mentha, the true mints, but so many other plants, salvia, lavender, a lot of culinary herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, oregano. And the genus Salvia is a good example where within that genus you have plants that grow in swamps and plants that are desert plants. So, you might know the growing conditions of one species in that genus, but you still need to find out what the growing requirements are of another species, because they don't all want the same. And this is the little blue cedar sage, Salvia Camidrioides. It's easy enough, but really seems to prefer a well-drained and site on the drier side. It does not tolerate wet, but given those growing conditions, it'll bloom all summer. It's already been in bloom for 2 months or so, and it'll bloom up until frost. It's sort of a little sub-shrub. It never dies completely to the ground, but retains stems over the winter. And in late winter, we cut it back by a half or so just to clean up the old flower stalks, which persist otherwise. But, similar Xeric salvias, or Salvia gregii and Salvia, Lordy, what's the other one? Microphylla, yeah, microphylla. And there are a lot of hybrids between the two. There's one right here. Salvia, I think this is Raspberry Delight. Yeah, that's Raspberry Delight. And Salvia gregii and Salvia microphylla are closely related. In gardens, many of the autumn sages are hybrids between the two. Yeah, and their common name is autumn sage. Here they tend to bloom continuously from probably April up until frost. I suspect in a climate like Southwest US and Mexico where they're native, and the summer's much hotter and drier than here, that they probably are somewhat dormant in the summer. You know, I'm sure they're still leafed out, but probably just barely getting by. And then in the fall, when the weather cools off and there's a bit more rain, they probably burst out into a heavy bloom. This was had a lot more bloom a few weeks ago, but we're dry again, so it's responding to that. But once we get a rain, it'll be back in full bloom and does tend to bloom fairly continuously all summer long. Many selections. In a few minutes we'll see an orange flowered selection. You know, pretty indestructible if you have a good sunny, well-drained spot. They don't need excessive drainage, just, you know, they avoid soggy soil. They'll tolerate average soils. Any questions on any of that? They're fairly well known and really are worthwhile plants. And I'm sorry, the hummingbirds love the salvias. Interesting. Oh, something else right there. This is, I guess this grows from a bulb. This is a Balbini, B-U-L-B-I-N-E. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that name. And this is, there's its label, Balbini Abyssinica. Abyssinia is the old name for Ethiopia, but it's a bulb that we've had in the Arboretum for a long time, and it just blooms for months in the summer. It looks a lot like a small Nymphophia. And there's another species that we've had for a few years down in front of the Lath House, Balbini Narcisopholia. I guess someone thought the foliage looked a lot like narcissus foliage, which is, to my mind, not all that distinct. Behind the Balbini is an oregano. You know, we all know oregano from the kitchen, and there's some that, you know, can be used in the kitchen and our garden ornamentals. But this is actually Origanum acutidens. I did not know that species. And look, there's some garden hybrids like Kent Beauty that are very similar. But these are really beautiful. They're in bloom for months and months in the summer. And, you know, your culinary oreganos have these little purple flowers, but they don't have these big showy bracts, and that's what makes these ornamental ones especially attractive. I think they're really beautiful. And pass that around. And, you know, very drought tolerant, but perfectly good in a, you know, normal growing situation, provided it's sunny and good drainage, average drainage or better. Oh, I have to talk about this plant. Decades ago, JC introduced this Gallardia to the Arboretum. This is, everyone knows the Indian blanket flower that's typically sort of brick red with yellow tips to the petals. And the common Gallardia tends to be more of a short-lived perennial or biennial, sort of blooming itself to death, and then in most gardens coming back from seed. But Gallardia estivalis is a permanent perennial in the garden, provided you don't put it in a soggy spot, but just average moisture or even a dry spot. It will bloom all summer long. Now, this is Gallardia estivalis in the wild typically has yellow foliage, and out on the far side of the Great Lawn you can see, did I say flowers or foliage? It has typically yellow flowers. And you can see that out in the beds on the far side of the Great Lawn. But this is Gallardius Devalus, the subspecies Winkleri. And Winkleri more typically is sort of pink to purple, but this is a white form of it. And in a lot of plants, the white flowered form of a typically pigmented plant, sometimes they're weaker growers, but this white form of Gallardius Devalus has been a really robust grower. There's a purple one we've had at times in the perennial border, one named by Plant Delight's Nursery, Grape Soda, that grows fine, but it's not as robust as this one. And you know, it's spreading underground. We don't get seedlings from Gallardius Devalus, but they spread underground. I would never consider it weedy. And it certainly more than earns its keep because it'll bloom up until frost. Really, really great plant. We usually propagate it just by division. You can pull, you know, dig up a bit and just pull it into separate little stems. They won't have much fruit, but I have always found that every little piece will survive and soon make a nice plant. Or you could, you know, dig it up and divide it and replant it directly. One of the best plants. I don't know if you've been visiting the Arboretum for many decades, you might remember a marble sculpture that was over by the old rose garden. That sculpture now lives at the Gregg Museum. That's where JC planted Gallardius Devalus originally, and there were some dry summers that were, you know, the dry weather just went on for many, many weeks, and that just kept on blooming as if it was, you know, a sweet day in spring or something. Really amazing plant. I think one of the best perennials to be introduced in the last 30 years or so. Yes, you have a question? The ice plant? I think the ice plants are all South African.
I think,
yeah.
But I wanted to
yeah.
see whether you agree.
Yeah.
I know all this.
Yeah. This is an ice plant. Delosperma, big genus in a big family, the Azoaceae. I think all members of that family are succulent. And the many of them are, you know, common landscape plants in frost-free parts of the southwest U.S., but many of the Delospermas are winter hardy, and the best ones will bloom all summer. This is probably taking a little rest after its big spring flush of bloom, but it'll be back in bloom before too long. But I realize I haven't really mentioned succulents at this point. The term succulent is a lot like the term evergreen. It's not a taxonomic group, it's a description of the plant, because, you know, you could call Salvia greggii evergreen because it does retain foliage throughout the year, but evergreen is not a family or a genus, it's just a characteristic of plants. And the same is true of succulents. There is not a succulent family. Succulent is just a characteristic where some part of the plant has evolved to store water. And this Delosperma and other members of the Azoaceae have succulent leaves. I don't know if that shows up, but I've squeezed one leaf and there's quite a bit of moisture on my finger. And I mentioned that this is a leaf succulent because when we look at cactus, nearly all cactus are stem succulents. They lack leaves, and instead the water storing part of the body of the plant is the stem. So, and you know, succulents, having the characteristics of succulents, there's some families where the whole family is characterized by being succulent of some sort, but then there's other families where some members are succulent and others aren't. The Euphorbia family is a good example. I was hoping to find some prostrate spurge which is one of our most common weeds, but Charlie's done such a good job of weeding that I don't see any. Hope Charlie's listening. But you found one? Thank you, Chris. Perfect. The Euphorbia family, when actually even just the genus Euphorbia, is a good example of a genus or family where some members are succulent and others aren't. This is one of our most common summer weeds. It dies with frost, but thrives in hot, dry weather. And it's the prostrate spurge because it grows flat on the ground. But you would never characterize this as succulent. The leaves are real thin. Of course, another real common euphorbia is the Christmas poinsettia, and you wouldn't consider that succulent, the big, soft leaves. But then there are many members of the genus Euphorbia that are succulent. Crown of thorns is one, but it's not especially succulent. But there's many members of the genus Euphorbia that resemble cactus, but all cactus are New World, native to the Americas, and the succulent euphorbias are primarily native to Africa and drier parts of India. And many of them resemble cactus, but they're not cactus. They, the bodies are somewhat different, but the flowers are extremely different between the Euphorbia family and the cactus family. So, the point I'm making is that succulence is a characteristic, not a taxonomic group of plants. We've been adding a lot of cactus to the rooftop garden, and I've added some. Plant Delights Nursery has donated lots of them. Mike Papay used to have a garden in Chatham County, but he has moved from the area. He donated a bunch of cactus. And some of our cactus, especially the ones from Plant Delights, are sort of trial plants that we're planting to see if they are winter hardy. And when you plant a bunch of seedlings, the value in that is sometimes, most of them die, but there'll be one that's more cold hardy than the other. People are surprised to find that there are cactus in cold climates. This is this tiny little guy, and it doesn't get much bigger. It'll make start to multiply a little bit. Is a Escobaria Missouriensis from, the upper Midwest. It has bloomed, but I don't remember what the flowers look like. You can see the spent flowers that might be turning into fruit. Cactus flowers are often extremely beautiful, but they're often very briefly in bloom. I have a little hybrid peanut cactus at home, and yesterday morning, the bud was promising to open up, and I didn't get home till 6:30 or 7 last night, and the flowers were spent already. So, the birds coming to the bird feeder probably enjoyed them yesterday during the day, but a lot of the cactus flowers are only open for a day or a couple days, but absolutely exquisite in many cases. One problem with a lot of cactus will tolerate cold, but some of them won't tolerate winter wet. The ones that are native to North America and a lot of the Mexican species will tolerate winter wet, but a lot of the South American cactus have to be dry in the winter. So it's not the cold that kills some of them; it's sometimes the winter wet. But that's just a generalization because some of our best hardy cactus are South American origin. This is a really odd one. Mehunia poepigii. There's a tropical plant that's named for the same person, Poepig. And he's actually a German with that family name that doesn't look very German to me, but this little guy has made a mound, and it has big, sort of butter yellow flowers about that big, much bigger than you'd expect on that little guy. In some cases, you'll see some of our cactus are sort of overgrown by their neighbors, maybe like a thyme plant or a lavender plant or something like that. But in the wild, the smaller cactus often do grow either in the shade of a small shrub or on the shady side of a rock. They don't choose those locations, but they will thrive in those locations because they're a little bit more protected from the harsh and very hot sun. And we all realize that the spines on a cactus are there for protection, but they also serve the purpose of shading the body of the plant to slow down loss of moisture. So, the spines are often sort of acting like the lath house, providing some shade. And with some cactus, especially the jumping choyas, and we'll see one later on, they attach very firmly into a passing human that's weeding in the garden, or a coyote running through the desert, and that's a way to get spread far and wide, because eventually they'll fall off that coyote and root into a new location. I tend to think that's the purpose of the fishhook spines on some cactus. Okay, and you might be puzzled why we have red buds up here, because red buds aren't exactly xeric, though I can tell because this one has glossy foliage that it has a bit of the subspecies of Cercis canadensis texensis, which is more heat and drought tolerant than your standard eastern redbud Cercis canadensis. But this was a fun idea that Mark Wethington had. Both of these are weeping ones. In time, so they trail down and you see them from down below. I think a lot of people, travel from the parking lot to the building and don't realize there's a garden up here. But if these are trailing down over the wall, then maybe they'll look up and wonder what's up here. I think this is Ruby Falls. Oh, it must be Ruby Falls. Yes, it is. And I think this is Traveler. But Texensis does have a lovely glossy foliage, which is a really nice feature, because I tend to find the foliage on Canadensis can be kind of dreary in the summer. We have a young plant of Golden Falls, but it hasn't gotten tall enough to go over the wall yet. This is Euphorbia Rigida. It bloomed months ago, and the spent flower stalks, somebody, probably Charlie, has cut off the spent flower stalks. It's evergreen. This will look this way all year round until it blooms next late winter. Big heads of sort of acid yellow flowers, almost chartreuse. The stalks that flower will die, but it'll be replaced. These are all shoots that it produced since it flowered. These plants don't live forever. They do get tired and die out, but it produces enough seedlings that you should always have it in the garden. Year-round beautiful foliage plant and quite showy, very showy in bloom. The little autumn sages do come in a range of colors. This is, one of those modern cultivars that has a not very friendly cultivar name, Egben 002. It's in a series, Heat Wave is the series, and this is Heat Wave Blast, but it's, fairly different color in that range of salvias. But Salvia Greggii and Microphylla, the typical colors are pink and red, but also white, and but there are yellows and corals and violets as well. We met the Hesperalo earlier, our first plant, and I mentioned it was a woody lily, and of course the other plant that has been described as the woody lily are the agaves. The genus agave is quite large. I don't know how many, I suspect 100 or several hundred species. And they range from the upper Midwest of the US, so from very cold climates, but all the way through the arid tropics. And I do need to mention that I know I used to think that tropics meant a wet climate, but the term tropics just means frost-free. It could be wet or dry. So a lot of deserts are tropical in that they're dry and but frost-free. So agaves range from very cold hardy species to ones that are tropical and would only succeed here as a summer plant or a plant taken inside in the winter. And some agave plants get huge, 5-6 feet tall, but others are small. This is a wonderful smaller species, Agave Lophantha, and a very beautiful variegated form, quadricolor, four-colored. And maybe the majority of agaves are spreading plants, and you see this little offset is quite a distance from the parent plant. Good 6 inches. More typically, they make a solid mass spreading outward. But others, other agaves, and we'll see some examples, don't make any offsets. So when they bloom, the whole plant dies. Whereas these ones that make colonies, if this plant bloomed, this rosette would die, but the plants around it that did not bloom would continue on. Gee, I wonder if this one way over here is an offset as well. It's traveling fast. But they're all, almost all the agaves are viciously spined, and, I admire them, but if I have to weed around them, I weed very slowly. I think this is, here we go, Thymus masticina? No, Thymus zygus. I did not know that name. Brush the foliage, it has sort of this menthol-like fragrance, sort of like eucalyptus, but and this is almost done blooming. You see they have this flower head, but the actual flowers are these small whitish flowers. But thymes and many other members of the mint family are really good plants for pollinators. We have a big bumblebee there visiting the flowers. Probably a week ago, when it still had lots of flowers, there'd be a lot of pollinators on it. This cactus is going to have a flower later on today. Some of them open at certain times of the day. Maybe some general comments on the rooftop. This is full sun all day. The soil mix varies from bed to bed, but it's extremely well drained soil mix. A good part of it is this gravel. This is permatil, which is shale that has been puffed at high temperatures, sort of like Rice Krispies. So it's lighter weight than your standard gravel. And we are now on top of the roof. If we jump up and down, Mark could probably hear us down in his office. And a real useful concept for us all to keep in mind is don't fight the site. This is sunny and it's very dry. We could plant water lilies up here if we came up and watered them once an hour. Or we could grow, daylilies and Japanese iris up here if we watered it once a day. But, that gets pretty ridiculous. Just, the amount of water and the time spent watering, though I guess it could be automated. I started in this job in 2017. 2018 was quite wet for a good part of the year, and then in late summer it stopped raining, and suddenly realized that how dry this spot was. And so since then we've just been planting very drought tolerant plants up here, and a lot of cactus, a lot of Mediterranean members of the mint family. This is another oregano that's not yet in bloom, but this is one that's quite that you could certainly use in the kitchen. But later on, it's fairly showy in bloom. It's one named Lizzie. and rosemary and lavender. A lot of desert natives like the agaves and the cactus we've met earlier. And because we're working with drought-tolerant plants up here, we rarely water up here unless we've gone many weeks without rain. We did a lot of planting recently, and so we do some hand watering of newly planted things, including the cactus. This one with the flag, that's newly planted, but a lot of these guys are newly planted. But they seem happy. And why did I plant this agave here a few weeks ago? To keep people from trying to remove this concrete ball out of the ground. And there's this adorable little dwarf prickly pear here, the little one that Plant Delight's named Potato, that never amounts to anything either because people stand on it or they take little pieces of it home. So maybe in time it'll amount to something. Makes a pretty little carpet of chubby little stems. This is an interesting cactus. This is the Echinocereus viridiflorus, meaning green-flowered. And you see echinos a lot in cactus name, or like in the purple coneflowers or echinacea. It's referring to not groundhogs, hedgehogs, which are, spiny. And that's what echinos is referring to, is spiny. But this is actually, Tim got this from a garden near, actually it was a piece of land where the owner let him collect it from, and it was near Denver, Colorado. So this is an extremely cold hardy cactus. And it has small, translucent green flowers that are quite lovely. It bloomed about a month ago. Those might be fruit. But I don't know how many different cactus we have up here. The Noodle Cactus is a South American genus, and many of them are really good. These were good size, maybe 1.5 inch yellow flowers. They do retain these spent flowers, which I guess are becoming fruit. And another species of Noodle Cactus we have up here, Submamulosa. This little seedling's coming up, which is fun. Oleander, I figured we could try oleander up here because down on the coast you see it growing in, the median of a highway in pure sand. This is their second summer and they haven't thrived, but they're surviving, so maybe in time, when they get a big root system, they'll bloom. This is Poliomyntha Bustamante. Poliomyntha is descriptive generic name. Bustamante certainly sounds like it's named after somebody with a good Italian family name, a Bustamante. Maybe Spanish name. But this will bloom all summer if it doesn't get terribly dry. And it's a shrub. And I really don't think it has to have this super dry location, but it does tolerate it. And being a mint family member, it's usually highly visited by bees. Many species of cactus only ever have one stem, but I especially love the ones that make multiple stems and you end up with a nice cluster effect. This is another Echinocereus. Triglochidiatus. Glockids are hares, so it has hairs and threes, I guess, at some point of the foliage on the plant. But it has scarlet flowers in spring. It's now done for the summer, probably. Some species will bloom repeatedly, or maybe not repeatedly, but periodically over the summer. Really beautiful agave, and one that can fit in most any garden is Agave Victoriae Reginae. This is the Agave Victoriae Reginae, and that's another clump of a not different selection of Agave Lophantha that we met earlier, but Agave Victoria Reginae is an example of a plant that only ever makes one rosette. And so when it blooms and the seed is ripened, this plant will be dead. I think we still have a few dead ones that bloomed last year that we can see down below. But beautiful, you know, the geometry is really beautiful. The white markings on the leaves are really beautiful. The spines, terminal spines are good and sharp, but it doesn't have a sawtooth edge to it. And this is about full size, so I changed. I was about to say maybe it'll bloom next year, but looking at the way it's clustering in the middle, I almost think it's going to put up a flower stalk this year. And the flower stalk will get 12, 15 feet tall. But, probably everyone has figured out what Victoriae Reginae means. Queen Victoria. Yeah. I hope in my time doing these presentations that people have gotten a little bit more comfortable with the scientific names of plants. When you realize that it's not just gibberish, that very often it means something, or is just commemorating a person, like, the grass Muhlenbergia lindheimeri, commemorating 2 German botanists that were collecting in the U.S. The names are maybe a little less scary. And sometimes they're fun. Oh, this is one of my favorite plants on the roof. This is a little persimmon. It's not our local persimmon. This is a Texas species. The persimmons are in the genus, I never know how to pronounce this, but referring to food of the gods, Dio, like in deity, and Spiros, food. But this is Diospyros or Diospyros texana, probably about full size. This one is, I'm going to say it's a female. Yeah, certainly is, if not a female, it's maybe it's dioecious, because it does make fruit. They're about the size of a pea and they're black, and I've eaten them. They're not particularly tasty, and I'm a super big fan of our native persimmon. The fruit are so delicious. But I just think it's a beautiful little tree with its mottled bark, and it's evergreen. Maybe need to do just a tiny little pruning so you can see the trunk a little bit better. Oh, a real curious plant. Ephedra is a real primitive plant. It's it's closely related to conifers. And if you look at, technically this is not a fruit, but it's very much like the fruit of a yew or a plum yew. But ephedra is the original source of ephedrine in cold medicine. And what is their common name? Joint cedars or something like that? But there's a number of different species, and we have several others, but some are more upright growing than this one. But these red fruit are on it for quite a while. It being a primitive plant related to conifers, it's not going to have a flower, but it's going to have probably something more like, pine flowers or something like that. This provides a good example. Cactus are stem succulents, and and that has flower buds, good. But most cactus stems are ribbed like that. That allows them to swell and expand depending on how much moisture they have. They can expand without bursting and store water when it's available and then shrivel up. And in some of the species that are native to cold climates will sort of draw themselves down into the soil. In the winter, they don't completely disappear, and this is not one of them, but it might be an inch shorter overwinter than it is right now. Some of the mammillarias do that. But, cactus flowers are really, can be really beautiful. Some of the gymnocalyciums aren't all that showy, but many of them are really showy. But because they're in bloom so briefly, I think a lot of them are beautiful just to grow for the form of the stems. That's a good example of a large growing agave. That's probably all one clump that's just spreading around. The big ones can take up a lot of room. But if you have the room, yeah.
What would be the lifespan of an agave like that?
The question was, what is the lifespan of an agave like that? The common name of agaves is century plant, because people thought they took 100 years to bloom. Now, agaves in where they're native in really arid climates are a lot slower growing than in this climate, because agaves are, some dryland plants have to be dry when they want to be dry. I grow a lot of houseplant succulents, and there's some that you don't even think about watering all winter because they have to be dry. But there are a lot of plants that tolerate dry that will also make use of every drop of rain they have year round. And agaves are that nature. They're not an obligate dryland plant. They're a facultative dryland plant. So, they will grow much faster in the east than in the arid west. Do you see the little plants over in the corner there? Mm-hmm. That's the same species, and those have been, this is their second full summer in the ground, and they were about half that size when they were planted. I know we planted those just before shutdown in 2020. Okay. Yeah, we had a bunch of cactus and other agaves to plant, and Tim and I did that just before we shut down in 2020. So they're, it's probably going to take that another 4 or 5 years to get up to this size, but about this size, this could bloom. I think the dead one was still in place down there. You can see the plant is about that size. Agave Victoria reginae is a small growing thing, but they certainly don't take a century to bloom. But in the desert, they might probably take a whole lot longer. Years ago, when Plantulites nursery in their gardens was already well established, a nurseryman from Texas was visiting Plantulites, and he said, you get about as much growth in 1 year on agave that we get in 10, in an unirrigated landscape in the Southwest. So they are much faster here. So, if you're thinking, I don't want to plant that because it's going to die eventually,
So's everything, but...
Well, no, some things like these spreading ones are going to haunt you for the rest of all time.
Yeah.
I mentioned the jumping choyas, which used to be in the genus Opuntia with the other prickly pears, but now have been put in their own genus Cylindropuntia, because instead of the flat pads of a typical prickly pear, they have these cylindrical stems. People are going to hate me for years to come for planting this here, because this is, a lot of the cactus, if you bump into them, you might get poked, but that's the end of it. But this is one of the jumping choyas, where one of these jointed stems will probably break off and attach to your clothing or to your arm and travel with you until you liberate it. But it's going to get 6-8 feet tall and have big colorful flowers. It's a selection from Mike Papay, who used to have a garden in Chatham County, that he named Mosaic Melody because the flower color is varied on the plant. But interesting cylindrical growth habit. Let's see, and we met Hesperalo Companioleda out front. This is the more common species, Hesperallo Parvaflora. This is not up to normal size. Parvaflora is normally about this tall but more upright than Companioleda. And the typical color is a darker coral red. This is a selection called Coral Glow. There's also a yellow form. And last week in one of the big box retailers in Cary, they had a selection of Hesperalo Parvaflora called, the trademark name is Stoplight. The cultivar name is Purpa, but it's a darker version of that coral color. But they were nice plants. Not yet in bloom, but a great xeric plant, Anesthesis Quadrifidus, common name. What? Thank you, flame acanthus. Everybody knows acanthus, the big foliage plant. So why would this be Acanthus or flame acanthus? Well, it's the same family. It's a big family, and most members of that family don't have the big, broad foliage of acanthus, but the flowers are, I guess the floral characteristics are somewhat alike. But this will have flowers about the color of that Hesperalo, starting sometime soon and continuing up to frost. And it's another great hummingbird plant, tubular coral red flowers. We have a selection called Pumpkin that's orange, sort of pumpkin orange color. In milder climates, this would be a shrub. Here in most winters, it dies to the ground, and if it doesn't die to the ground, we usually cut it to the ground so it gets off to a tidier start than if it's growing off of old stems. These outlying plants are probably seedlings. We do get a fair number of seedlings from it, but a plant I would include in the garden, for blooming all summer and loved by the hummingbirds. Questions on any of that? We have another ornamental oregano over here with smaller bracts than the one we saw a moment ago, but this is Amethyst Falls. I always hate picking a single flower from the garden, but it's sort of a smaller scale version of the one we saw earlier, but still showy bracts and the little purpley lavender flowers. Someone's going to ask if it's used in the kitchen.
Is it used in the kitchen?
Thank you. That actually has quite a good oregano fragrance, but I'd hate to remove any flowers from the garden. Little salvia related to the ones we've talked about so often, Salvia coahuilensis. I'm guessing a Mexican species, really nice violet colored flowers. We met this Beschorneria maybe 2 months ago when it was in glorious full bloom. But the thing I want to report on this morning, we thought that maybe it was monocarpic, like some of the agaves that bloom and die. But this morning, in preparing for this walk, I noticed that it was setting up, you can see some offsets developing there. So we're really pleased that we're not going to lose this plant. It hasn't set any seed. There's no fruit developing on it. So maybe after this tour is done, we'll cut it down. But it was absolutely dramatic, a month or two ago. The question was, do I know why the Beschorneria did not set seed? No, I don't know. It might be a plant that needs cross-pollination, or maybe there weren't pollinators to visit it. Those tubular flowers, I suspect, are primarily pollinated by hummingbirds, and it bloomed really early, so we might not have had hummingbirds yet to visit it. And then it's native to the Southwest. I'm not sure whether it's Southwest US or Mexico, and there's multiple species of hummingbirds that are probably there year-round. If we had a cold Zone 7 winter, that Beschorneria might die, and so I think it's probably native to a milder climate than a typical Zone 7, and I suspect there like in California, you have hummingbirds year-round. Just guessing. We have a number of butterfly bushes. The genus Buddleia is actually fairly large. The common one is, very well known, but the other species are not known much at all. This is Buddleia wardii, and I meant to look up to see where it's native, and I don't know. Does anyone know anything about Buddleia wardii? But it's not showy in bloom, and I think it's already done blooming, but interesting foliage plant. Leucophyllum. Leuco is referring to white, like white blood cells or leukocytes. But this is typically a silver foliage plant, Leucophyllum frutescens, but this is a fairly green foliage selection called green cloud. But it's in the figwort family, the Scrophulariaceae, family characterized by tubular flowers like that, and it blooms for an extended period of time. It's native to Texas and Mexico, and one of its common names is Texas sage, maybe only because the foliage looks a bit like sage. I don't know that it has much fragrance. Interesting little morning glory, Convolvulus Mauritanus. It's managed to sort of weave its way up into that yucca, but it's primarily a ground covering little plant. It dies away in the winter and returns each spring. This clematis here is not in bloom, but some xeric plants they're from humid climates, but they're have evolved adaptations to dry climates, because where they occur in the wild are places with adequate rainfall, but the soil's excessively well drained, and that clematis is native to shale barrens where the soil is very rocky. Or some xeric plants are native to like rocky outcroppings in otherwise humid climate, but whereas the neighboring situations where their plants are growing in normal soil and it doesn't dry out quite as quickly, they don't need to be drought tolerant. But if the only place you can survive is because you're not outcompeted by more vigorous neighbors is in these very extremely well-drained locations, you develop adaptations to drought tolerance there. Oh, I feel like I'm just blathering and not making much sense now. I wish there were more questions.
Is there a sign for that clematis?
Yeah, I think it's right there. Yeah. Clematis fremontii. Yeah. A name for somebody with the family name of Fremont. This is the fried egg plant. And last week it had lots of flowers. Now it's done blooming and it looks like it's developing some sort of insect problem. It's a California native. The genus is Rhamnea coulteri, commemorating two people's family name, Romney and Coulter. But the flowers are about that big when it's in good condition. And I think we often see a little bit more sporadic bloom later on, but its main bloom is now past. And it's a big herbaceous perennial. I think we cut it to the ground each winter, but I'm not sure. Poppy family, Papaveracea.
In that garden, just kind of beginning to peep through. Maybe they got up there by accident.
Up there?
Uh-huh.
There might be, or
It looked like,
yeah, there.
or something else.
Yeah, it might be the. We'll see some of the other thing. The prickly poppy.
Well, it just didn't look like it, but we'll see.
Yeah,
We'll see.
yeah, because they have a similar white flower.
Okay.
Yeah.
There weren't any flowers. It was just some leaves.
Oh.
And this has such unusual leaves.
Yeah.
I just wondered if some sort of got up there by
There could be.
accident.
Yeah, there's also a rue up there that has a leaf that's shaped like this, but quite a bit smaller. I'll have to
They
go
were about
looking.
this size.
Okay. I certainly still don't know all the plants in the garden. Fire me. And Baptisias, typically more mesic growing, but this is actually a hybrid between Baptisia arachnifera, which would mean bearing spiders, but I think what it's referring to is bearing like cobwebby hairs on the leaves. And hairiness is another adaptation to a dry climate. You think of things like lamb's ears and stuff with real woolly foliage. That's another adaptation to dryness and sometimes to cold. In the humid east, we do have some ecosystems that are very dry, like some of the very sandy soils of the coastal plains in parts of the eastern United States. Desolarium are another woody lily, another thing that used to be in the lily family that are now in the asparagus family. And the Desolariums, almost all of them are characterized by these long, narrow leaves with the sawtooth edge. So they're very beautiful architectural plants. In bloom, great big tall spike of flowers. Small flowers, and many, many small flowers, but highly favored by pollinators. But the main reason you grow them is for the architectural form of the plant. And some of them have nice sort of blue-gray foliage. This is Desolarium Texanum. I'll let you figure out where it might be from. Well, no, years ago, someone on a plant tour asked me, what does japonica mean?
Oh boy.
And, she was probably functioning with the attitude that all these names are gibberish, I could never understand them. And once she realized they mean something, I think, her comfort level might have increased a little bit. Nolinas are another woody lily. The flowers of the Desolariums are a lot like the flowers of the Nolinas. The Nolinas generally do not have a sawtooth edge to the foliage, and just like yuccas can either be, essentially stemless in that there's not an above ground stem, or they can be, the Nolinas can also be like this yucca where they have a trunk above ground and eventually get fairly tall. There's a really nice big Nolina outside the White Garden. I think this is Nolina lindheimeri. I think I remembered that's what it is, but so many of these trunkless Nolinas are very similar one to the other. Oh, we're under this wonderful tree. We'll have to get a better look at it from far. This is the desert willow, not a willow at all. But you see it gets its name desert willow because of the willow-like foliage. It's actually in the Bignoniaceae. I think I'm correct in saying that. So same family as like the Campsis, the trumpet vine, and Catalpa. And it's closely enough related to Catalpa that you can hybridize the two. And this is Chalopsis, and you cross Chalopsis with Catalpa. The hybrid has been named Chitalpa. And to my mind, it's not an improvement on either parent. I love the Chalopsis. They bloom for many months in the worst of summer. This cultivar is Bubba. There's a beautiful white one over by the color trials, Angel White, and they range from white to pale pink to sort of burgundy pink. There are some new hybrids that are more compact. They grow multiple trunks, so I think if you wanted to grow them, but you wanted to keep it more in like the 6 to 8 foot height, you could cut stems down periodically, encourage more stems from the ground and grow it with many trunks that are smaller. But a great, drought tolerant summer blooming shrub to small tree, native to Texas and Mexico. hard to find for sale in this area. High Country Gardens is a mail order nursery, and they occasionally offer like 5 to 6 or more cultivars of Chalopsis, but they sell out real quickly. So if you see them in their catalog in late winter, early spring, buy them right away, which is what I failed to do this year. But they're quite easy to root from stem cuttings. We see the California poppy down there in the typical sort of orangey yellow, a cream colored form here. They are hardy annuals. What is a hardy annual? Well, their typical growth habit of the California poppies is to germinate in late summer, fall, and grow through the winter months. That's why they're hardy annuals, because they're winter hardy annuals, and then bloom now. And by time it's already produced some mature seed. That's a fruit that's already shed the seed. By the time it's done blooming and has shed a bunch of seed, these plants will die. It's a true annual. Completes its life cycle and die. And they're doing what I had hoped they would do, in that they're sort of naturalizing in here. Even though the Arboretum's focus is on winter hardy plants, perennial plants, I think an annual that comes back from seed every year without being weedy is a sort of a perennial annual, is how I think of them. Another selection of Salvia gregia, I think that's Teresa, so this pastel bicolor flower. Oh, and the chocolate plant. This is a member of the aster family, that huge family with sunflowers and other things. And yes, you have to smell the flowers. They do smell like chocolate.
Oh, they do.
Yeah. Don't be embarrassed. Even cool people smell flowers. The genus Aloe, I think, used to be in the lily family as well, but I don't remember if it's now in the asparagus family or whether it's in its own family. There have been so many rapid changes in recent years, and next week when I talk about the asparagus family, I'll detail a bit more, but classification used to be based on morphology, which to my mind means basically things you can see with your eyes. And now so much of taxonomy is based on, DNA and, things you can't see with your eyes, I guess, but, the DNA of the plants and stuff. And so things that we thought were closely related, the DNA says, no, they're not related at all, or things that we didn't think were closely related, DNA research says, these are really closely related. But anyhow, I'm not sure if aloes are in the asparagus family, but it's a big genus. Most of them are not winter hardy, and we were standing right next to a little Aloe aristata in full bloom up on the roof. Of course, full bloom, it's this tall, and the foliage is about this tall, so maybe that's why we overlooked it. But this has been a big surprise, because this is Aloe Maculata. Maculata mean spotting. And if you put IM, Chris is telling me it's 10:35, so we need to stop, or soon. Well, I'll finish talking about Aloe Maculata. If you put IM in front of Maculata, what do you have?
Immaculate.
Yeah, immaculate means unspotted, so maculata means spotted. But this you might know this aloe by an older name, Aloe saponaria, the soap aloe, saponaria referring to soap. And your typical Aloe Maculata is not winter hardy, but this one has been. It's gone through 3 winters now, and it's already bloomed this spring, and it'll bloom a couple more times this summer, and it's usually in bloom again in the fall. But handsome plant, but in bloom, the flower stalks are this tall, real showy, bright orange flowers. And I think it's time for this one to be dug up and divided, because it's one of those plants that gets really congested, and it doesn't mind being congested, but if we dig it up and divide it, it'll multiply that much quicker. Because even, these little plants in the center that are having trouble amounting to much, if they were divided and separated out would soon be blooming size plants. Well, I thought we would have gotten through more of this, but Chris is telling us to stop, so I guess we'll stop.
Part 2.
What?
Part 2.
Part 2. Yeah, next lifetime. Yeah. And, we didn't even get to talk about the eucalyptus family, the myrtle family and stuff, but that's why I've been carrying these two things for the whole morning. But anyhow, oh well. Any questions before we end?
What's the name of that chocolate plant?
Oh,
Doesn't have a label.
yeah, it seeds around, so it's wandered away from the lake. Berlandieri. I'm sure it's named after somebody with the family name of Berlandiera. I don't remember the specific epithet. It's native to the southwest U.S. and probably into Mexico, I'm guessing. Pretty easy plant in the garden. I wouldn't plant it in a shady, soggy spot. Beyond that, it would persist. I suspect in rich soil it might flop, but in this very lean, dry soil, it stands up nicely. Yeah, it's fun because when there's enough in bloom, you can sometimes notice that fragrance as you walk by. I hope everybody stuck their nose in it. Other questions?
Yeah, what's that eucalyptus that you got there?
Amplifolia. It had bloomed earlier. And I've been carrying this whole morning and I've knocked off the fruit from probably last year's bloom. But see the red bottle brush down there? That's in the eucalyptus family, in the Myrtaceae. And this, plant family names are taken from the first name genus in the family. And the eucalyptus and the bottle brushes, the callistemums, are in the Myrtaceae. Well, this is Myrtus communis, which is a Mediterranean native, so Europeans have grown this probably for thousands of years. And Myrtus communis is generally not reliably winter hardy in zone 7, but these were cuttings from an ancient plant that the gardeners at the Elizabeth Lawrence Garden in Charlotte rescued off of a dump truck that was on its way to the dump. They stopped by a garden that was being renovated, and this had these big gnarly stems and is about this tall. And it is blooming. I've never seen myrtle flowers before, but they're sort of rumpled for me. Sort of my worry stone or whatever all morning. The flowers smell a little funky. The foliage has a nice fragrance. Many members of the Myrtaceae have fragrant foliage like eucalyptus. And most members of that family, like most eucalyptus, are not winter hardy, and most bottle brushes are not winter hardy, but that woodlander's red is. That shrub down there with the cream flowers is worth noting. It's eucalyptus and callistemum and the Lomatia, which is in the Protea family, the Proteaceae, are all native to Australia and areas around Australia. So, and most of those plants are not winter hardy in this climate. Or things like Protea need really bizarre, extremely low fertile soils to succeed. Actually, Proteaceae is also prominent in South Africa. That's right. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll officially stop. Chris was, I'd noticed, gathering hands full of gravel to throw at me.
I was not.
Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Doug, for a
Sure.
wonderful tour, and thank you so much for many years of wonderful tours, Doug. We really appreciate it. We've learned so much from you over the years, and we love you for it.
Well, thank you. And I must say one of the hardest parts of my job was coming up with topics for these weekly programs. Yeah.
And of course, thanks to all of you for coming in for the tours.
Yeah.
Love seeing you here, and we'll see you again next month for the interns.